Hello Daily Drafters and welcome to the format follow-up video for the Brothers War. We had this format for a fair amount of time, but it is now time to say goodbye in true daily draft fashion. And what that means exactly is that in this video, I will provide you with all of the information that you need to know to put a bow on the Brothers War and look forward to the next format. If you have any desire to draft the Brothers War again in the future, such as a flashback draft on Arena or at home with your friends, this will be a great video to reference to give you a quick reminder of how the format shook out and what to be looking for during your revisits. Let's dive in. We'll start with tier rankings for all of the viable decks in the format, starting with the tier 3 decks, blue-green and red-green. For reasons that I will also explain later, the Power Stone ramp archetypes, of which these two decks were originally advertised as, really didn't come together. This format ended up being less about big, fat, expensive monsters, and more about early aggression and board presence. The fact that a lot of commons and uncommons in these colors were dedicated to the bigger mana ramp strategies meant that these two decks really never got off the ground. Next, I wanted to give a special nod to a category of decks that are usually not viable in most formats, but were here in the Brothers War, and that is monocolored decks, specifically mono white, mono red, and mono green. These three decks, more so than mono black and mono blue, were exceedingly viable in the format, and while they didn't come together very often, if you found yourself as the only drafter at the table in one of these three colors, supporting a monocolored deck became a strong strategy. The presence of several colorless cards at common and uncommon is likely what facilitated these strategies. In Tier 2, I have black-white and blue-black. The reason I have these two decks in Tier 2 and not in Tier 1 is that the original advertisement of what these decks were built to do really didn't come together very well. Black-white was advertised as a mana value 3 or less deck, and blue-black was advertised as a deck that cared about drawing 2 cards in a single turn. Now, it's not that these themes never came together, but rather that they relied on some great uncommons and several rares and mythics, and if you didn't get access to some of these cards, you really couldn't compete with the best decks in the format. And finally, in Tier 1, I have what is likely a large statement on the format as a whole, and that is the presence of these 6 decks. I really do believe that good to great versions of all 6 of these decks could compete with the best of the best in the format. That may be a bit of a cop-out, but I think the viability of this many decks in Tier 1 speaks to the balance of the format and the replayability and fun that comes with it. Now, we'll go ahead and dive into my top 10 takes on the format as a whole. Number 10. Energy Refractor is the glue that holds this format together. Now, I'll admit that this is a bit of a meme, but not entirely. I did truly love Energy Refractor in this format, almost to a fault. Now, there are several reasons why this card is such a high pick for me, including the fact that it drew a card, which some decks cared about. It was an artifact entering the battlefield. It was an artifact on the battlefield, ripe for the sacrificing, and the mana filtering was surprisingly relevant for splashing. Number 9. Don't fall for the obscure build-arounds. While cards like Slagstone Refinery, Symmetry Matrix, Tawnos the Toymaker, Meticulous Excavation, Thran Vigil, and the Tron package might seem like fun build-arounds, a lot of these cards really just didn't get there. If this format were at all slower than it ended up being, maybe some of these dirtily do-nothings could have been fun, but you just never had the time to put a lot of these cards on the stack. Number 8. The Retro Artifact slot was a huge plus. While there were a couple of egregious inclusions like Wormcoil Engine, the majority of these cards made the format much more fun to draft and play. And even though Wormcoil was stupid busted, I never drafted or played against a single Wormcoil Engine in 27 drafts of the format, so they really don't show up very often at all. But cards like Chromatic Star, Elsewhere Flask, and Ichor Wellspring being so synergistic in the format, and only at the uncommon rarity, mean that you could almost reliably count on seeing some of these throughout the draft to include in your synergistic decks. Number 7. The official daily draft color rankings. In 5th, and noticeably so, is blue. In 4th, although I wanted to move it higher, was green. In 3rd, I've got black. In 2nd, the most aggressive color in the format by far, red. And in 1st, I went with white. I don't have too much of an issue switching white and red, and maybe even black in some cases, but the Mardu nature of the format and its lean toward aggression is why I landed where I did. Number 6. Some archetypes require rares and mythics to really succeed. A lot of the decks could survive at the common and uncommon level, but several decks needed rares and mythics to really make them compete with the best of the best. Basically, each of the non-tier 1 decks fall into this category for me. I finished this format on a streak of decks that didn't really have any rares or mythics, and I really noticed when that was the case, especially because my opponents seemed to have several. Number 5. The official daily draft top commons in each color. In blue, we have Mightstone's Animation, which proved to be the head figure in a deck of its own. In green, we have Argothian Opportunist. In black, a consistent force in Overwhelming Remorse. In red, another card that led from wire to wire in Excavation Explosion. And in white, the best common in the set, Scrapwork Cohort. Number 4. Big, expensive spells are more often a trap than not. It's not that these kind of cards weren't good or powerful, a lot of them were, it's just this wasn't the format for them. Cards like Rust Goliath, even with the prototype buyout, really just didn't get there in the end because of how aggressive the format ended up being. You just didn't have time to cast some of these more expensive cards. Number 3. Unearth is more important to the format than prototype. Following up on the last point, because the format was less about big monsters and their prototyped versions, this meant that the more aggressively slanted mechanic, Unearth, shined much brighter. Cards like Scrapwork Cohort, Scrapwork Mutt, and Mishra's Juggernaut ended up wildly overperforming because it turns out Unearth is equal to what ended up being almost an entire card in a lot of situations. Number 2. This format aged quite well. I'll be the first to admit that the first few weeks of this format were not my forte. I was trying to do things that the format just didn't support. It took me a little longer than most to come around to the fact that the format was in fact fast and not slow. It's not that I didn't know that, I think it's more that I didn't want to accept it. Now that being said, the more I played the format, the better it got. I was able to put together some nonsense decks later in the format like Red-White Reanimator and Mono-Red Tron, but that's because I knew what the format called for to succeed and I built my decks with that in mind. I ended up drafting the set 27 times, and I even enjoyed my 27th draft. And number 1, this format is not as advertised. As I have touched on before, if you're coming back to this format for the first time at any point in the future, if you take anything from this video, know that the format is not about big, fat, expensive creatures. If you're hoping to play blue-green ramp or any sort of Power Stone ramp deck, you'll be sadly disappointed. Treat this format as a very aggressive format built around 2 and 3 drops with lots of Unearth, and you'll be fine. It's not that this makes this format inherently bad, it's just not at all what we were promised in week 0. Thanks so much for tuning into the channel for the life of the Brothers War, and if you didn't get to see many drafts or just happened to discover this format follow-up video, go ahead and subscribe to the channel to get in nice and early on the next format. We'll be switching focus to Phyrexia All Will Be One later this week and into next week with several set review videos. Thanks again for being here, and I'll see you soon for more daily draft content.